Good afternoon. Skip Meyer here with more stories from my life. I previously had done a couple of stories about the Second World War and my dad and my Uncle Bob's contribution towards it, titled The B-29 Brothers. I'm going to pick up from there, and I'll start by explaining how they got into the war, how my Uncle Bob did. The B-29 took a full complement of crew of 11 men. That included bombardiers and so forth, and pilot, radio operators, everybody. And they did all their training elsewhere, but they got together in Wichita, where my dad was building B-29s. And as one rolled off the line, they would have a crew trained and ready to go with it, and they'd fly to the Pacific Ocean or into the Pacific Theater where the war was going on. Anyhow, a crew has gathered to take off with the B-29 heading for the Pacific Theater. The B-29s went elsewhere. I think there was one went to the war in Europe, but generally they were made to go to the Pacific Theater because everything was so far apart. Japan was way out in the ocean, China had mountains and so forth, and we didn't have anything that could make an impressionable attack on Japan itself until they built the B-29s. So they were rolling them off and putting a crew in them, trained and ready to go. Now they can't make it completely to the Marianas, where they were going to be stationed out of. Marianas are part of the Philippines. That's on the other side of the world if you look at a globe. So they made a scheduled stop that the Army Air Corps had arranged, and I believe the stop was in Guam. Now Guam is just an island, big rock island, out in the Pacific, and it had a big Air Force landing strip, and also had a harbor for ships. And the plan was, and the orders were, that the crew of 11 would take the plane to Guam, and there the mechanics at the airfield would go through the plane, refuel it, check everything out, kind of like the first tune-up in a car, after you drive it 1,000 miles. The crew of 11 was supposed to get some sleep. They had arranged bunks and so forth for them with the Army Air Corps. Typically of young men, and that's what they all were, they were headed out into an unknown world, a world of battle, and they had read everything in the papers and seen newsreels and so forth. They knew what they were getting into, and I can't fault them at all, but they decided they wanted to have a little fun before they got into it. So they walked over to the military bar nearby. Now, the 11 of them took a table, and there was a good crowd there, according to what Bob told me later on. Half of it was probably guys from the Army Air Corps and half from the Navy. And they started drinking, and one of the sailors got up and started what is I don't know if you'd call it a game or not, but I've done it uh, when I've been in situations where there's a lot of people and they're not doing anything. It happened at Disney World with me. Somebody yells out, "Anybody here from Minnesota?" And I happened to be one, and we chatted for a while, killed some time while we were waiting in this line. And that's what happened. One of the sailors got up and yelled exactly that, "Anybody here from Minnesota?" My Uncle Bob obviously was one. And he from across the bar, and again, he said it was a big place. He put his hand up and yelled, "I'm from Minnesota." And the sailor says, "Meet you at the bar, I'll buy you a drink." The two of them met at the bar, and he ordered him a drink, as he promised. And they started chatting, uh, one about where they were going and what they were doing, because they were in two different branches of the service. One was Navy and one was Army Air Corps. But eventually, um, the sailor, whose name was Wally, asked Bob, "What part of Minnesota are you from?" And Uncle Bob said, "I'm from St. Peter, Minnesota, down on the river south in Minnesota." I guess it took Wally by complete surprise, because he said, "I'm from Minnesota. How can you be from Minnesota? I've never met you." Well, after a little conversation, um, Bob and Wally discovered that Wally was like 2 years older than Bob. So while they were in high school at the same time, Wally was ahead of him and graduated, and Bob spent the last 2 years in high school without him. So they actually, their paths never crossed. But now they did, halfway around the world. So they had a lot to talk about back home, talk about common friends. I think they discovered that their fathers actually knew each other, which would be my grandfather. He was county treasurer, and Wally's dad was a local doctor. And they knew each other. So it's a small world, and that's what surfaced there. And the two of them became immediate friends. They had a lot to talk about. The night wore on, and it was getting to be time for them to leave. Wally back to his ship, and Bob back to the airport, where they would get a few hours of sleep anyhow before they continued on their journey. And they walked to the door together, shook hands, and Wally said something about, "We'll probably never have our paths cross again." It was quite a coincidence that they did meet from the same hometown. They're in two different branches of the service. The only thing they had in common was they're in the South Pacific, but that's a pretty big area, pretty big ocean. And Wally's in the Navy in a ship, on board ship, so they knew they'd never have their paths crossed, but he wanted something to remember each other by. And he says, "When this thing is done," and by this thing he meant the war, he says, "Let's meet back in St. Peter." And he says, "And I'll buy the first drink." Uncle Bob says, "You got a deal." Shook his hand, and he says, "Tell you what, when I meet you, can I bring my sister along? I think you might like her. Her name's Benita, but everybody calls her Bonnie." And he says, "You got a deal." And the two went off their separate ways. A few years later, they both made it through the war. They both saw a lot of action, but they made it. And they kept their word. They looked each other up in St. Peter, and became lifelong friends. They went different directions vocationally, and Bobby eventually moved to Minneapolis, but they remained friends through their whole lives. Wally was the first one to pass away. He had a good life. Matter of fact, he was the winner of another little game that they play in the service, and that's he was the last man on his ship. It was what they call a last man club. When the war got over, the boys that were on his ship all chipped in and bought a good bottle of brandy, the best they could buy, and it was passed around amongst them until the last man has the bottle and everybody else has passed away. And the idea is he's supposed to open it and toast his fallen comrades. Wally did that. So he had a good life. He was buried in St. Peter, where he spent most of his life. Uncle Bob was in Minneapolis, and he came down for the funeral of his longtime friend. During the funeral, he stood near the coffin, and next to him stood Wally's widow. Her name was Bonnie.